All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you've been with us all today, appreciate you hanging out with us. If you're just joining us for this session, welcome. My name is Julie Hausch, and I'm SCA Knowledge Development Manager. And I want to welcome to the session, Innovations and Trends in the Beverage Marketplace. This session, we're kind of playing with different formats in all of our session, and this session has a slightly different format. We're joined by three esteemed beverage analysts from Rabobank. They host a great podcast called Liquid Assets. If you haven't heard of it, I totally urge you to add it to your podcast listener apps, wherever you are. And their podcast features discussions about the latest trends and innovations in the beverage marketplace. And so that's kind of where we came up with the idea for this session. So now I'd really just like to welcome, and I'll get out of the way, welcome Jim Watson, Bourcard, Nesin, Stephen Rannekliev, and they've prepared a special podcast style presentation for you today. But you can totally still play along. Don't forget to drop your questions in the Q&A channel that you can find by clicking the channel tab in the chat. And the Liquid Assets crew will answer them at the end of this session. So take it away. Thanks, guys.
Steve,
awesome. Thank you very much, Julie.
Did you see, Steve, that I was listed before you in the chat?
It didn't. Yeah. I wasn't.
That was an unfortunate oversight, and I apologize to
completely wrong.
Everybody watching today that Bourcard got any more billing higher up than he possibly should have. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad we could join you today to talk about kind of some of the innovation we're seeing all around the beverage world, and we're going to try to make it relevant to what's going on in the coffee retail space as well. So this is definitely a little bit different than a normal presentation for us. And what we're going to be doing is I'm going to lead off. I'm going to go through some slides, talk about what we're seeing in the market, talk about what some some of the data is saying, but then we're going to bring Bourcard and Steve back in, and we're going to kind of do a live podcast. We're going to talk through some of some of the points that they see. So Steve is such an expert in wine, so we're going to talk about some of the lessons that coffee companies might be able to take from what wine companies have done over the last year. And Bourcard is our e-commerce expert, so we're going to dive into e-commerce, direct consumer sales in particular, and talk about a lot of the innovation going on there. So are you guys ready? Awesome.
Let's go.
Put up some slides as well. At the end, we are going to take questions, and we'd love to answer lots of questions from everybody. So please put them in there, and we can't wait for that at the end.
We'll be personally hurt, actually, if you're not paying attention enough to ask a question, to be honest.
That's true. You'll be graded on the quality of your question and the quantity of your question, quite frankly.
And the fewer questions you ask, the more Bourcard will talk. So I strongly encourage you to ask more questions.
That's right.
And the fewer you ask, the more I'll cry. So we don't want either of those things.
Yeah. Well, I work with that.
Yeah.
So on coffee and not Bourcard's tiers, I kind of wanted to start out with just an overview of where coffee consumption fits in with the rest of the beverage world. And this is all off-premise data, like measured channels. So this is grocery kind of data, and the growth last year. And the first thing you see, right, 2020 was a wild outlier in terms of growth for every single beverage segment, for good reasons. All we're seeing, in that chart, in the big orange data is the big shift to off-premise from on-premise. And that's fine. We'll get into what's going on in the off-premise soon. But last year was a weird year. But before that, coffee had been a little bit weak in the retail segment as well, which it is a little bit important because it had been weak really because there's less innovation, I think, in the grocery segment, and there's a little bit of slowing K-cup sales. So K-cups had driven huge kind of off-premise coffee growth for a long time, but as it's already achieved probably half by dollar sales. So a little bit less growth to drive there. But how this translates into overall numbers is interesting too. We think, that 10% growth in off-premise coffee sales is probably, about, a couple points decline in overall coffee consumption in the US, including on-premise. And I don't know, Steve, if you have a good translation for some of those alcohol numbers, what they are.
Yeah, and we'll get into this, in the presentation that I have. You kind of see the wine figures up 15% last year, and we'll touch on that. That's, again, that's really just looking at measured channels, and there's an awful lot that goes on below the surface there, and the real number is much, much lower, and there's a lot of disruption and a bigger impact on supplier revenue through all of that, but we'll get into that in a few minutes.
I would also say, Jim, I think one of the things that ends up happening, especially with more sales going online, is that the people that measure sales like IR and Nielsen are really slow to pick up on sales from these people like Amazon. They don't share data readily, and so there's a very good chance that some of this off-premise decline is really just a lack of being able to measure digital channels effectively, especially with like subscription services and direct-to-consumer sales taking a larger chunk, which I think is a real challenge for Nielsen and IRI going forward. But I'll leave that out.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it affects different parts of the coffee market differently. I just wanted to also set the tone with kind of how we're looking at, this is really in relation to the last year. So, you can think COVID changed everything. And obviously, in terms of an on-premise, off-premise shift, it didn't. But it's important to start with the thought that it didn't really change what consumers want. If you want a specialty coffee, you still want a specialty coffee. If you just want really easy convenience and comfort, you are still going to search out those same things. It changed how and where we consume these beverages. So now we're doing it at home far more often, and it changed how we buy them. As Bourcard said, we're buying a lot more on e-commerce. And because of that, there has been so much investment, I think, in, basically how companies can find new routes to find their consumer, because the consumer isn't in the same place that they were a year ago. And so we'll talk a bit more about that, some of that new investment soon enough. But I also want to talk about pricing, because I thought this was fairly interesting. So you head into a year where, it's a recession. You talk about economic difficulties, tons of, unemployment. And then you think, okay, this is a year where people are going to trade down, find cheaper ways to get their same beverages. So we would expect to see that certainly throughout the coffee world. And we didn't. This is an example, though, from of off-premise coffee data. And you can see coffee pricing has actually been really weak in off-premise for the last 4 years before 2020. That's mostly like the rise of private label K-Cups. So it's not quite apples to apples. I think consumer sentiment is still pretty strong there. But last year was really strong, which is a very unique factor. And I think what we saw there was consumers who couldn't get the coffee that they really liked in the coffee shop and stayed home, brought some of those brands home with them in a different way, and were shopping for much more premium options in the grocery store. I don't know, Steve, did you see something similar in the wine world?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at, and again, it's what you're measuring, right? It's the off-premise. If you look at kind of Nielsen IRI data, the wines priced above $10, particularly above, let's say $15 a bottle, you were seeing growth rates kind of in that 10 to 25%, right? But what it's kind of missing is, some of the higher growth rate channels, the higher average price channels that were losing share. So you kind of have to look at it and understand what you're measuring and what it's, that it's also kind of covering some of that channel shift.
Absolutely. I mean, it all looks great when you're looking at just the off-premise data, and it looks like people are spending a lot more, but it's not necessarily like a fair comparison by any stretch.
That's exactly right.
And then we look at, okay, so what exactly were people buying? And there's a huge spike in whole bean coffee. And again, so Bourcard, what do you normally spend on your coffee? Bourcard is our, official most expensive coffee buyer, and probably in our whole office.
Yeah, I usually my go-tos are Heart Coffee out of Portland, Oregon. Oh my God, they're good. And Counterculture. So usually spending around 20 to 18 to $25 for a 12-ounce thing of beans. But the only reason I can use those beans is because I got a burr grinder, which I apparently sales went through the roof, right?
Yes, you were one of many thousands of people buying all kinds of new home equipment, and which was a big deal kind of in those whole bean sales, right? So this is people, you really like you wanted your coffee shop experience if you were buying whole beans. Now you've done a couple new things, right? You've invested in new equipment, you've invested in coffee subscriptions, perhaps. And these are things that they are pretty interesting because I think they're a little bit stickier going forward. And so you have some people who love great coffee, who've made some new investments. It's going to be a little bit harder, and you're going to have to work harder, perhaps, in the coffee shop world to draw them back into, the everyday of going to the coffee shop to get their coffee there. Interestingly, I think this would be a place where we'd see the missing e-commerce data a bit. I think whole bean and probably single cup are missing a fair amount of growth. That would certainly single cup. A lot of that growth is going through Amazon. Whole bean, probably a fair bit of it going through subscription. So those might be even greater kind of growth rates compared to compared to instant roasting ground. I also want to talk a little bit, just so we can get the picture of where consumers are coming from, and I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the rest of the non-alc world. Because I think there's some interesting trends of what people are looking for. So the chart on the left, if to help you make sense of it, this is all of the growth in new dollars coming into the non-alc segment over the next 5 years. So that's saying like bottled water will get about a third of new dollars coming into non-alc. And there are a couple things. Like, why are the categories that we see growing there growing? You're seeing things that are functional, that are, I'll put up the air quotes, healthy, and it growing, and anything that isn't CSD or juice. There's a little bit of growth there, but they're vastly under indexing. They're much bigger categories currently. And to be fair, ready to drink coffee is actually growing pretty well. It's maybe 7 or 8% total growth, and it's only 2% of the market. So growing much faster than everything else, especially if you're doing multi-serve there. I mean, a couple things that are on trend there, right? You're seeing a lot of powerful flavors and flavor innovation coming to market. And I think these are relevant because this is like what is driving new consumer growth in the market. And you can see that Bang and Ugly are ones that, they may be low calorie in terms of being, artificially sweetened, but they're massive, big flavors. You're seeing additional functionality, Perrier adding some, caffeine, or water adding, kind of doing the alkaline thing. So people want more from their beverages, but there's a lot of innovation. Interestingly, Starbucks is kind of coming out finally with like a slightly lower calorie version and more upscale coffee forward part of their coffees, as opposed to the pure Frappuccino line. So there's still that kind of health side of things as well. And then it's interesting to think about what deals are going on in the space and what they kind of tell us about what has changed, right? And it's, you can first look at the Dunkin' deal and think, we just went through one of the toughest years for on-premise coffee sales, on-premise everything in beverages and food. And it didn't stop a huge $11 billion deal for Dunkin' brands. The JDE Pete's IPO also with both retail but on-premise exposure. IPO went off without a hitch, and I think there's a lot of other kind of smaller deals that are also super interesting. There are a lot of beer companies getting into coffee, so the whole coffee world, especially in the ready-to-drink world, where that makes more sense for them. A lot of people trying to play in that space. You've got new competitors like Chibo coming into the roasting ground grocery space, and we haven't seen innovation there or new brands there in a really long time. But then we also see a number of kind of deals going on in the coffee and coffee adjacent space. So I mean, the first one, Kopi Kananigan, which is out of Indonesia, is they're tech enabled, right? So this is like a coffee shop that has big digital presence, basically. And you're going to see them getting a lot of money and from a US backed fund, in fact, or kind of plant-based, other tech platforms for paying. This is there's still a lot of money basically flowing into the coffee world, and even especially the on-premise side of it, if people have a pretty good option there, which has been fairly interesting for us. And I'll talk a little bit about the kind of biggest things I see for the big themes in the coffee shop world for now, and then we'll get into what Bourcard and Steve have to offer. But I mean, we've seen some huge changes, right? So digital has been going on, and mobile and order and pay has been been a big trend. Starbucks has been reporting the data for a long time. It got very accelerated now, and the spread throughout the entire chain has picked up a lot, right? And this is, you also want to go to a coffee shop, just please make it as easy and safe and quick as possible. And the widespread adoption comes as people get used to this. So as with all the e-commerce adoption, consumers are simply willing to hop in during this year, and then they're establishing some new habits that we really think can stay. But not everybody wants to do it that way. Drive-throughs, there was kind of a quote from the CEO of McDonald's saying, they thought they had tapped out on drive-throughs, many years ago. And then all of a sudden, COVID comes around, and now they're rolling out new drive-throughs everywhere. And we're seeing this across the coffee shop world. I think people are really looking at the physical footprint of their spaces to see if this makes sense. Right now, drive-throughs make a lot of sense, and the entire industry is spending a lot of money investing in this, not just coffee shops, but all kinds of quick service restaurants as well. And interestingly, I think the product selection matters too. And it's not just introducing new kind of non-coffee objects to be, a slightly broader shop, but just the pure innovation side, which is why I've got the picture with all the tabs there. As people go into the grocery and into at home, that they still are going to need a lot of innovation. Coffee shops have always been the innovation hub for the coffee industry. And there's really been an acceleration there in terms of the number of different offerings you can get in a coffee shop. And I think that's going to become far more and more important as we go forward. Say like, okay, why am I going back out to a coffee shop? Well, on the left side, you made it really convenient. But then, you're also offering something I absolutely cannot get, at home or in another location. So I think that's super important.
That's one of the things I always think about with the e-commerce side, right? Like people are always asking me, what's going to happen to retail long term? And I'm like, you can invest in e-commerce. You can also invest in having an awesome store experience, right? And that's like the perfect counter action to it. So I would actually feel pretty confident that I think we'll talk about it later, but it's definitely one of those things where a great cafe experience isn't replicable and will always have a value to consumers. It's a cool thing.
I mean, beyond even the community side of it, right? If you're just talking innovation, the trial side of it, you're not going to necessarily order something big in e-commerce to try, or there's certain drinks that just don't make sense that take a lot of preparation, right? And those are always going to be central to that experience, both in coffee, but throughout the rest of the beverage world, you're going to get your cocktails much more likely from a skilled bartender than you are trying to do it with whatever DrinkWorks machine you just put on your countertop at home.
It's not the same.
It's not the same. But with that, I want to bring in Steve now and start talking about a little bit about what he has seen in the wine industry, which has faced a lot, especially the high end of the wine industry is faced a lot of the same problems those running a coffee shop might have faced over the last year. They've put a number of new ideas into the works. So maybe Steve can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for pulling me into this, Jim. And as you were presenting, I think I saw a lot of things that you were talking about, the channel shift, some of the challenges, the investment to kind of respond to changing consumer habits. That's a lot of what we've seen in the wine industry. But I think starting with that top line number, that Nielsen number, that you showed, the 15% growth, and that got a lot of headlines last year. People saying, "Oh my God, everyone's just everyone's sitting home and just chugging tequila," and maybe in the case of Bourcard, judging by his research last year, maybe that was true. But for the most part, that was really just masking the some of the losses in other channels. And overall, so it was a year of massive disruption for us. Overall, I would say it was, we did okay. Overall wine consumption, on the whole was up something like 1%, but it wasn't that 15 to 20% that people were talking about, in the middle of last year, right? And so it was, and frankly, we were fortunate, because when you got to places like Spain and France and Italy, where it skews even much higher to the on-premise, those guys took a much bigger hit. I think total consumption in Spain was down something like 17%. So they got hit really hard. But even for us to make up, for that 15% growth in the off-premise was offsetting some of the declines that we saw in the on-premise last year. And the on-premise here is about 17% of wine sales. But that is really, it's a really important channel for a lot of the smaller premium wine sales. We talk about average price, kind of some estimates I've seen have it close to, average price in the on-premise in the US is something like 50% higher than what it is for Nielsen measured channels. So it's revenue wise, and that's not what the consumer pays. That's revenue that the supplier gets, right? So it's a much more profitable channel for brand owners, and maybe more importantly, that's a channel that's much more fragmented than the large retail chains. So it's a channel that a lot of the smaller suppliers kind of have access to, and it's a really important channel. So the decline, we kind of estimated that on-premise sales of wine were down something like 45% last year. Right. You look at what overall restaurant sales, you have to kind of take out McDonald's, because nobody's ordering a Bordeaux, nobody's ordering Cabernet Sauvignon with their Big Macs, except maybe Bourcard, of course. Yeah, I saw that look. So that channel.
Steve, I don't know. My favorite fast food restaurant in college was Miami Subs, and they always had a Dom Perignon on the menu.
Well,
and it was like a running joke in college that someday we were going to go in and order the $200 bottle of champagne at a random sub shop.
And if you're in Europe, there are places you can get beer at McDonald's and so forth. But in this market, that's not happening. And when you look at, you kind of go back to that off-premise versus on-premise. You go to Safeway, Kroger, Publix. They don't generally have a great allocation of Chateau Lafite or Chateau Latour, right? That's not where you go for your first growth Bordeaux.
And it's this. We say the same thing in the coffee industry, right? Like there is a lovely display of specialty coffee in grocery stores, but it's really just from a few national brands. The selection you see there doesn't resemble at all the total coffee being consumed in that neighborhood or the world of specialty coffee.
Well,
it's not even close.
I mean that was actually an interesting thing that my local grocery store in Brooklyn. I now live in Portland, Maine. My wife got a job here. Don't want to get into it, but
but you did.
Whatever. But our local grocery store actually went from having very few good brands of coffee to having a bunch, right? I've actually saw in real time this transition towards much better coffee. And I moved here to Portland, and it's exactly what you're describing, Jim. It's Genvalia or whatever. There's this
Genvalia,
yeah. That's the highest end brand they have. And so it's quite interesting that it's still pretty underdeveloped. But I do want to interrogate this one narrative, Steve, and maybe Jim, on this subject, which occurred both in wine and coffee, was Folgers making a comeback, right? The old dead brands kind of coming back to life. Can we all agree that that's part just channel shift, and one part just never going to happen again and it's going to go away so fast?
Yeah, trends are going to revert to where they were, right? I don't think, whether you're talking Folgers or Carlo Rossi or, Peter Bella, the boxed wines that were flying off the shelves, I don't know that that's necessarily, that's unlikely to come back. I don't think the large wine suppliers are planning on that. And to your point, though, Bourcard, even in grocery stores that didn't have great allocations of high-end wines, a lot of those wineries that lost all that on-premise, they were suddenly, now they, some of the retail chains that didn't have allocations before, suddenly, wineries that didn't want to be seen in those formats, now they couldn't be so choosy, or they had access to them because there were other people had lost those allocations.
Yeah.
So what sort of channels, finding your way into grocery seems like a nice way, right? So you lose some of your high-end restaurants, you're searching for everything else. What other channels were like some of the wineries looking for to find outlets, to find the consumer that wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing, you kind of have the on-premise, off-premise, and then you have DTC, which is really important for a lot of wineries, a lot of the direct-to-consumer sales. That's, and that was also hit really hard. And again, it was interesting because you look at, what gets measured and what doesn't, and it looked, that everyone was saying, oh, direct-to-consumer sales are spectacular this year, because if you look at what we measure is what gets shipped, and that was up 27%. What it missed is, half of all direct to consumer sales happen in the tasting room. Kind of like for coffee, it's what happens in the coffee shop, right? All that gets lost. So what gets measured is this increase of 27% of what gets shipped. What gets lost is the 45% decline in sales in tasting rooms, right? And again, this goes back to the issue of who's winning and who's losing in all of this, because in California you have 5,600 wineries. 30 of them are what are considered large. Maybe they sell more than 500,000 cases. Those 30 large wineries make 80% of the wine that gets sold, and the other 5,550 are fighting for that 20%. But yet, it's small wineries make up 85% of direct-to-consumer sales. So this is a really important channel for smaller wineries, and so it's a channel that also in terms of revenue for wineries, the direct-to-consumer sales are 4 times. The average bottle price is 4 times higher than what gets measured in Nielsen. And you're capturing all that margin from the wholesaler and retailer.
But I remember at the start of the pandemic, the Wine Institute coming out with a survey that said like 40% of wineries will close with the current conditions continuing for 6 months, which we were like, oh yeah, it's going to be like over in 3 months, whatever. Not gonna last.
And the Brewers Association said the same thing about breweries.
Brewers said the same thing. I'm sure the surveys from like Harvard Business about the coffee shops said like something like half of them were going to close, or restaurants. Like
there were dire numbers. And then recently I think the guys at World Coffee Portal put out something that said in the U.S. Sales were down a third. So that's a very rough number, but for those who are exposed to the on-premise, that's pretty standard across beverages. But the number of closures was actually relatively small.
Yeah.
Which is lovely for those of us who love to go out and drink at our local brewery and drink from our local coffee shop.
Yeah. And Steve, like just because it might be illustrative for what happened in I guess coffee as well. I guess I say that simply to say because there are so many similarities here that some of the things that were happening in wine were probably reflected also in what was happening in coffee as well.
No, fully agree. And there was this idea that tons of wineries were going to close and that it was going to be the death knell of a lot of wineries. But they did find ways to pivot. It was a lot of the first responses look for ways. How do you cut costs, and then how do you kind of pivot and respond? And there were lots of small wineries that there were plenty that kind of said, oh, it's going to be over soon, and just kind of they waited to respond. But there were lots of them that found ways to kind of switch and find new growth avenues and so forth, right? And you had some that were big shift to, as we saw, Bourcard, and you'll get into this, but e-commerce, telesales, like how do you dig into that? And there was a company did a kind of an analysis a few years back, and their thing was, if you want to build e-commerce sales, you've got to the first thing you do is throw away your printer, right? And it's about capturing emails and capturing the contact information from people who come in, and people were wineries were leaning into that and reaching out, and people responded, right? People care. You go to visit somebody's winery, you've spent time with them, you develop a relationship, and you hear they're being challenged by the current context, especially if you're locked at home and you have to buy, you've got nothing to do but buy wine anyway. People responded, and that was part of that ability to shift sales there. But and they were also finding new ways, within all of that. You're trying to drive volume through that platform, and you kind of had to take pricing. You did see some pricing, declines in the direct to consumer sales. They were, creating these mystery boxes, right, where you kind of go and I kind of buy from off one of the wineries I buy from is Boleto, and they kind of came out with a promotion of mystery boxes, and it's a nice way to kind of mix and match, get the consumer to try new things, and also maybe if you're going to take pricing, and you don't want it to be apparent to your to your retailer and wholesaler partners, that's kind of a way to do it, right? So they found some ways to do that as well.
Was the program called DTC in a box?
Exactly.
Ouch.
Anyways, it's not funny.
Yeah. No, and I think there were also kind of we saw a lot of push to new formats as we know the on-premise was hurting. A lot of that shifted to takeout, and we did see kind of a rise in interest in kind of half bottles and smaller formats. And we've been talking about this for a long time, right? The need for the wine industry. Jim Bourcard, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but in some ways it's kind of like the single serve pods, right? The rising interest in individual formats.
The wine industry has always had absolutely terrible packaging. A 750 that only works with 5 servings and doesn't keep well. It's kind of interesting that this was caused a reevaluation within wine, which is terrific. We even saw, I think, a little bit of a reevaluation in coffee too, in a move to multi-serve, right? So the opposite. So okay, we only sell one size of coffee, and it's like you're drinking a lot. You're drinking 8 ounces or 20 or whatever, right? But that move to multi-serve, where you could take away, maybe you could get a latte and you could take enough that you could save it for the next day, and served in the gallons. That's really interesting. There is no reason that any one of these categories has to be tied into a given size, and that ties you into a certain occasion that doesn't play well. So it opens up new opportunities to drink, and it kind of matches with what we saw going on, right? Both even in grocery stores, but in coffee shops. All the data said there are fewer visits, but when people went, they were spending more on this side, right? So you said, okay, if that's what's going on, they're buying for either multiple people or multiple drinking occasions. We can take advantage of that.
Yeah. The one thing I would say, you were talking about the 5 servings in the 750 milliliter bottle, that traditional bottle. When we talk about this in the wine industry, most people get the shocked look on their face and they say, wait a second, a 750 milliliter bottle isn't 1 serving, right? No, but
right. But I think the key, there's a lot of reasons why you want to give consumers, the servings they want. In this case, it's a gallon of flat white, if that's what they're into. But I think that the key
sounds
is
great. Deliver it to my house, please.
But it's also if you're interested in serving consumers throughout their day, throughout their lifestyle, why wouldn't you want to create an occasion that your brand or your product doesn't currently compete in, right? So if you're having a small, Steve is a good example. I have nice bottles of wine, up to $15 per bottles of wine. And I'm not going to open those.
I believe that's classified as the ultra luxury segment.
Yeah.
Almost.
Pretty close.
I'm not going to open that $15 bottle of wine unless the in-laws are coming over, because I don't want to open it and let it sit in the fridge and let it go bad. And so, maybe I wouldn't ever drink wine on a weekday because I don't want to open a bottle. And that's why it becomes a beer occasion. I think there's a lot of cases where, coffee can also kind of do the opposite, whether it's by offering larger formats or smaller formats, or putting it in a can, making it cold. I think that's really one of the coolest things is cold coffee kind of cooling you down during a hot day. I only do hot coffee typically, but it's okay. Yeah. Jim still thinks that 50% of coffee will be cold within the next 5 years or whatever.
I think in Starbucks it pretty much already is, right? And it will get there. If not, it'll get there soon. I'm a cold coffee, in the middle of winter drinker, so I'm definitely on the other side of that. Hands are freezing off when I'm walking outside.
But I think, the only thing I would add in all of that is, when we talk about formats and new products and whatnot, I think the interesting thing for me was, and this kind of ties into a lot of the research you've done, Jim, on hard seltzer, is, the intrusion of the wineries.
It's impossible to do a beverage segment talk without talking about hard seltzer right now. It just
absolutely
it cannot happen.
And, we had seen this before. We had seen kind of the Barefoots and other get into, coming out with a spritz that wasn't necessarily new. But what was really interesting to me is to see Duckhorn get into it, right, with I think it was the Decoy brand. And that's, to me, that's a really high-end brand. To me, it's in some ways a risky move. And my first response was...
So just for everybody, for me too, what does Duckhorn normally sell at?
Well, I mean, the high-end,
the fancy version.
The highest end of Duckhorn can be upwards of $100 a bottle. And then their Decoy brand, their kind of mass brand that sells in grocery stores, is still a $20 a bottle brand. It's very much a high end brand. And to take that and to put that into a seltzer, it's kind of like saying, again, going back to Chateau Lafite, would you put that into a spritzer, right? And we would always kind of laugh when wine was kind of taking off in China, where there were a lot of new drinkers, and you'd see them kind of buying Chateau Lafite and mixing it with Coke, and you kind of go, that's kind of it misses the point. But at the same time, I look at what they did with that Decoy brand, the hard seltzer, with the wine-based hard seltzer. It's a beautiful package. It's really nice. I want to scoff at it, but every time I look, I go, that's really nice. It really is aspirational. So I think there are a number of those things. And then I think, the other thing, though, that I think we kind of touched on was, how do you bring that experience to home, right? It's bringing the on-premise experience home. We wrote a lot about this at the end of last year. That was kind of one of the things that we saw beverage companies doing. We saw wineries doing that a lot with virtual tastings and, finding new and innovative ways to do that. And I think that was really interesting. Talking with one of the wineries last night that did a lot of that. We often think of it as kind of formulaic, and it's okay, you do online tasting, you engage the consumer, but so much of that is about the experience and making it fun, making it enjoyable. And you were saying the success often depends on the personality of the winemaker doing the tasting. And then they also did some partnerships where they brought in, I don't know if you've ever heard of Truffle Shuffle. It's kind of like a meal. This was another one that had to kind of change. This was a guy who had taken his life savings and invested in a truffle company that was going to sell direct to restaurants right before the pandemic. So he, and they kind of made a shift and started doing, sending meals to consumers to prepare at home with videos. And then they kind of did some live events, and it's been really successful. Kind of engaging consumers around this stuff. And so the winery is partnering with Truffle Shuffle, and they do some kind of joint events with their wine clubs, making meals with wine and so forth. And of course, Mr. Too sophisticated turns his nose up.
Yeah, Mr. Everyman is like, oh, Steve, let's just make sure this mainstream thing, like that online truffle service, gets mentioned here.
Well, but I mean, it's not even about truffles. When you look at it, it's not about truffles. It's really about kind of this experience of engaging and preparing food, pairing food with wine, and it's it's the event and kind of the experience altogether.
I've always wanted to have like it would always be so fun to have a high-end coffee person, do a virtual coffee tasting with me. Like, right? Like I would love to see somebody cup coffee. I would love to have somebody like help me learn more. And I know there's some resources out there. I know that Counterculture, for example, does a great job of educating baristas, but I really wish there was more consumer facing versions of that stuff. And once you unlock the digital space where you can have an unlimited audience for an individual, like one person's time, I think it becomes pretty clear that the benefit to your brand, as well as to making consumers better at drinking coffee, that just makes all the sense in the world.
All that connection and education that hopefully would have taken place in the coffee shop, right? Now you got to do it somewhere else. You have some way to do it. I mean, and you can have a better connection with the a digital like service too. If you're on someone's phone in an app, it counts, right? You can have some back and forth and tell them about your products. But thinking about like duck home growing into seltzers, there's just an article out on I think it's called Cool Crafted Beverage, the Pacific Northwest. And they were just working with coffee shops to roll out ready to drink coffee, right? And it's the exact sort of thing where like, okay, you are a coffee shop, you're missing your normal connection with people, you've got to find them somewhere else, right? So you can find them online, fine, but like now maybe you didn't consider doing a ready to drink beverage. It just didn't make sense a year ago, and that's fine, right? It probably didn't make sense a year ago. But now you're really searching for people, and people are searching for stuff at home, and they still love your brand, but they're going to be at home, right? They're not going into the office 5 days a week. All of those things that you might have considered then make a lot more sense to go find a consumer in a retail format, today, I think.
Yeah, and I think generally speaking, that's kind of out of all of this, right? It was a tough year in a lot of ways, but it forced people to kind of try new things, and you kind of hope that maybe there's some silver lining out of all of this, that we'll find new ways to engage consumers, new products, things that work that we wouldn't have tried otherwise.
And I mean, so one of the core ways to engage new consumers, was certainly to find them online. And so I want to give Bourcard a second. And it's always dangerous to hand them like the platform, right? To keep talking. But if you could just talk through what is some of the main things you saw in the e-commerce world in terms of brands adapting or people just building out like great new infrastructure for e-commerce sales that would be relevant.
Yeah, I kind of almost want to just say like there was like this massive. I mean, I heard your question, Jim, and I'm going to answer a different question.
Answer a different question.
Yeah.
Which
I'm going to answer the question I wish you asked me.
My next time I'll just introduce Bourcard, talk about e-commerce. Go.
Yeah. No, but I think it's really important to understand like what drove consumer demand. And it was like, okay, consumers, aren't going out anymore, right? So they would normally go to work and they'd pass by a coffee shop. They would normally go to their kids' soccer practice and they would stop by a coffee shop or stop by the grocery store. They previously weren't scared of dying of a deadly disease when they went out to a grocery store. And that's now a thing that is a serious consideration. So this is like a very real short-term thing that's going to create a lot of demand that is not going to be permanent. Now, does that mean that online is going to disappear a little bit? No, but it does mean that the consumer demand is going to decrease. What may change is the amount of investment from brands and retailers in the kind of infrastructure that they should have been building years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And e-commerce adoption is largely an artifact of population change in the form of old people dying and young people with tech savvy capabilities making more money and reaching their peak spending years. So if you can't keep up with the glacial pace of population change, you're probably doing things wrong. So in general, like companies weren't investing in any of this stuff. And for me,
it doesn't make sense to invest in any of this stuff until the day comes when suddenly it's massively important to do it. And now.
Well,
you're too late.
Well, this transition was already happening before the pandemic. You could see it in the data. You could see it in the people. So basically, millennials will be the majority of people. I think this year, actually, millennials were the majority. Millennials and Gen Z were the majority of people 21 and over. Never mind, I can't remember the statistics. Anyways,
It's
there
like
are more
majority of
lot of
people under
millennials.
80 or something, right?
There are more millennials and Gen Zers than boomers and silent generation people. Okay, so that's really important. So there's a lot of them, and they're reaching their peak spending years. The oldest millennials are now in their 40s, so like they're going to be spending a lot of money, and a lot of that money goes online. So it's obvious. For me, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that if we're going to see online grow in the future, it will require investment from the industry, and I find that to be like a really interesting self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like if I don't invest in it, it won't grow. And if I do believe in it and I do invest in it, it will grow. So I really think it's one of those things where the industry actually does have.
But Bourcard, you talk to the industry, right? Do they believe?
They do believe, but the year-on-year comps are going to be really funky, especially for retail. So I think we're kind of this time last year, the online sales were crazy high. You know, Instacart was 450% year on year in April and May last year. They're just not going to be able to keep up that pace. You actually saw sales kind of grow in May, June, April, May, June, Q2 of last year, and then kind of steadily decline actually after that, still above 2019 levels, but we're actually seeing a decline as people realize that it feels safe to buy a coffee in a coffee shop, or it feels safe to go shopping in a grocery store. And so that decline is going to continue until the pandemic is gone completely. But
well, I mean, coffee shops got safer too, right? I can order online and walk in, pick it up, and be out in 5 seconds. So I mean that changed at the same time.
So I don't think we'll have all the time to go through what I wanted to do in this section, because I do want to leave a few minutes at least for the Q&A. But I do want to ask one more question on the DTC we'll maybe talk about DTC if you want to talk about DTC, listen to our podcast. We just had a great episode on it, so you should do that. But I do want to talk about the kinds of e-commerce that each of us perhaps think is really interesting, something that caught our eye. And I thought maybe this is the question you just asked me, Jim, and I'll answer it by saying grocery. So I think grocery is a really amazing one. I think it's really important for brands to understand exactly what their obligation is in retail, and understanding that the brand's responsible for maintaining the product information in grocery, and understanding that the audience online for online grocery channel is way wealthier, way younger, way more urban, and also demanding much more premium products in larger pack sizes, right? So that really should inform brands and what they need to sell. But what's really interesting is that these retailers laid out a huge amount of infrastructure that especially for pickup and curbside pickup, that really fits the lifestyle of people in the suburbs. So the footprint of where online grocery was available was pretty small relative to the number of grocery outlets there were. And we're actually seeing some pretty massive growth in that. And it's very exciting to see that, as this becomes available, consumers are actually interested in going to it.
So I'll toss one out though. Imagine you open Bourcard's coffee shop where the lattes are $8 a cup because it's the fanciest one you can imagine. But you want to go online, right? You own a couple shops, and this is a story we're hearing more and more from. I'll hear it in small breweries and small coffee shops. You're trying to find a new outlet. How easy is that? Is that ability for a smaller player to get some meaningful, like either to set up their own platform through some of the third-party vendors, or to go through a bigger platform?
Yeah. So two things. One, your success during the pandemic in terms of pivoting as a retailer was closely tied to how good you were at having consumers' information in the first place, right? If you had events at your coffee shop, that means you had people's emails, and you could say, hey, we're doing growlers, or hey, we're doing a gallon of flat whites, whatever you want. Like, you were able to communicate with people. So I would say first, like for a shop, it's really important to, actually have a way to capture consumers' information so you can tell them about your online offerings. And that's what Steve was saying about, don't give out like printed receipts, only send it to people's emails so you can collect that information and communicate with them better. But to be honest, there's so many white label. When I say white label, I mean software that you can basically get, and it's pretty affordable actually.
Yeah.
And it can turn on immediately. And that also includes loyalty programs, right? Like, why the hell do we still, I don't know if people still do it, but these like stamp cards, right? Where you're like, oh, you get 8 and you get a free coffee. Like that should have been digital a decade ago. So I just want to say, like, those, if I were doing it, I think absolutely it's important to have that. Those technological solutions are there. Even if you're just a roaster, a brand, you know, having that presence is going to be good, and pretty cheap to set up. But it's really about having an audience to start with. Should we
move to the Q&A?
Yeah, let's. We got a couple questions here. So folks, if you have any more, fire away now. We're going to start asking some of the questions we see, and you know, the first one we'll stay on e-commerce for a second. But for mobile shops where there's only one size for lattes, how much sense does it make to add another size, or is it better having the option of pre-made lattes to go like in a 32-ounce bottle, for example? I mean, Bourcard, you take it, and I'll jump in.
Yeah. My consumption of 32-ounce lattes during the pandemic has been 0. But I think it's really important to understand that your online offering as your in-store or in retail offering should reflect what the consumers want, right? And so, you know, if you're getting feedback from consumers on social media or when they come and pick stuff up and they're saying they want that, you should give it to them. So I don't know if the answer is yes or no to that, but you should be trying to find out the answer. And if you know, the nice thing about having a website is you can be like, you know, coffee, like single serve, or you can have a different bulk like section on your website where people can order bulk coffee servings. And I think that would make sense. So I think it'd be silly to not at least explore that possibility. And then, you know,
run
if
trials,
it doesn't work,
right?
run trials. Yeah. Everything should be tested. And if it doesn't work, it, you know, the nice thing about doing stuff online or from your shop is it doesn't really cost anything if it doesn't work out.
And that was kind of the genius thing about the discussion with Vinebox, is how much kind of trial they did on different things, right? When you have that opportunity to engage the consumer.
Tell people what Vinebox is for those who don't know.
Go ahead, Bourcard. That's your contact.
Oh yeah, Vinebox is a wine tasting service. So if you can imagine, it's basically, you know, they send you a bunch of wines and you get to taste them, but it's really small format. So it'd be kind of like a coffee company sending you like samples of small coffees and you get to taste them and then go out and buy the ones you like best. But I think that's what they did, was they're really using the online split store as an opportunity, or the online sales as an opportunity to identify trends, figure out new brands, and messaging that's really effective and that can translate to help them in every other aspect of their business, right? Because if you are selling something online, and then suddenly you see like, oh my God, all these consumers are asking for oat milk or something else, and you didn't know, like, you can just make sure that's on your menu everywhere that you're selling coffee.
I mean, and the advantage sometimes if you're smaller and it's a little more manual to start is just, you're not setting up a giant, like you're not investing in a giant production line to put these out, but you have to make the call up front, right? You can make these and kind of play around and figure it out as you go. And eventually, hopefully get a little more streamlined once you figure out what consumers are really looking for.
There is another question here, right, Jim?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the images in the slideshow showed a selection of coffee and beer RTD products. And so the question is, that makes me think of things I've heard, you know, the desire for caffeinated beverages, whether coffee or not. But what opportunities are there for coffee to engage in these kinds of less obvious collaborations? You know, I'd say the rest of the industry might decide that for you if if the coffee industry doesn't decide that first. You know, as everybody's kind of trying to adding functionality across all beverages, even food, is a big thing. Adding energy is a core part of it. Adding coffee into it as your energy play, it happens to be a very like natural, you know, it's plant-based.
Coca-Cola coffee.
Coca-Cola coffee. I've got a pack of coffee snack bars at home, the equivalent of like 1 cup of coffee in terms of caffeine. Now you can see in your morning smoothies that'll come with coffee. I think there's a ton of room for literally every food and beverage product that wants to have any sort of energy aspect to it, to a coffee version. It's worth noting that in energy drinks, Java Monster is already worth many hundreds of millions in sales, and it's kind of a natural play, right? That the energy / coffee, as Coke is doing with Coke and coffee. Coke, all Coke wants to do is have more caffeine in its drinks, right? So it's rolling out Coke Energy and Coke Coffee just as ways to do that, and coffee is a natural one, most definitely. And
I also feel like brewing coffee and brewing beer is an interesting thing. Like you saw that Cologne partner with Molson Coors. I feel like there'd also be a lot of opportunities because of the slack capacity within brewing craft brewers right now, that there's probably a lot of opportunity and open places that, like, if you want to brew coffee at scale, there's probably some empty tanks out there needing liquid.
But there's also, it's the beer side is an obvious one, but also on the spirit side, right? The like Jameson's cold brew, some of that stuff. There was a collaboration between Few Spirits in Chicago with Chameleon Cold Brew. There's been some, there does seem like there's some opportunity for collaboration on the spirit side as well.
I think there is, and it's interesting what's interesting is how many other players around the industry are very interested in this. Whether it's getting involved in an alcoholic version or a non-alc version, there are lots of players that want, some coffee product to add to their portfolio. So I think there is a fair bit of room. Probably have time for one last question, so I'll take the next one there. Have you seen any coffee clubs, like wine clubs, or more of a coffee subscription, but more than a coffee subscription, but added experiences? I don't know that I've seen one that has a ton of added experiences, other than perhaps with a tasting, like, it's sort of an online meetup part of it. You can see there's a coffee company that's doing one that has like an auto refill feature. So, you kind of run out, it's on a scale and it'll reorder for you. But I mean, that's the same stuff Amazon has been trying for a while. But I mean, are there any, like, for you guys in terms of subscription services, even from other categories, that have anything particularly kind of noteworthy that you can add in? Otherwise, I mean, send me good coffee and send it regularly, and you pretty much got 95% of what I'm looking for.
No, I think the I would say that the cool part about that kind of subscription, right, is if you can actually link to purchase, that consumers. The next question is, what instead of just asking consumers what they want, like, how can you figure out what they want? And it's what they spend money on, right? So the cool thing is having one of these subscription clubs. Like, if you send them stuff, you can innovate in the different packaging. You can send them the same beans in different packaging. You can send them different beans in the same packaging. And if you have a large enough subscription list, you can start innovating and tweaking each one of these things, and eventually build a spreadsheet or whatever that says this sold well, and find the optimal combination of beans and packaging and branding that will be successful. So I would say that the why you would want to do that subscription service is really interesting. And how do you know what consumers want? They pay for it. They put their money, they open up their wallet and they buy it. That is the only great way to know. So that would be my response to that.
Don't believe what they tell you. Believe what they buy.
Yeah, exactly. Do we have time for any more questions, or are we about out of time here?
We have time for Julie to log on and tell us we are
to bring out the hook.
Exactly. This isn't a Joe Rogan podcast. We got to wrap it up. No, thank you.
Thank God it's not.
Yeah, we know 3 hours. But I will try to pitch you my hard seltzer latte after we go off camera or something. So I know, right? No. So thank you, Jim, Stephen, and Bourcard. Hear more from them on the Liquid Assets podcast, and we will be back with the next session of the Coffee Retail Summit shortly. It's investing in retail business, the case for coffee, and we'll see you in the chat. So thanks, everyone.